Welcome everybody to the Educational Research Department's online seminar. We're joined by doctoral researchers, staff and other interested colleagues. You'll be able to ask questions at the end of the presentation or via the Zoom chat during the presentation. The session will also be recorded and the recording will be available on the departmental website. Please can you all make sure, if you're not already, that your cameras are switched off and your microphones are muted during the presentation. I'd now like to invite today's speaker, Dr. Liam Wrigley, who is a senior lecturer in criminology and sociology at Leeds Trinity University, to share his presentation with us, which is today about NEET youth and education needs, hopes and aspirations. So whenever you're ready, Liam.
Hi, Georgia. Thank you so much for that lovely warm welcome. I'm absolutely delighted to be at University of Lancaster today. I'm not actually there in person, but where I am today is one of the community centres where I undertook this field work. So I've been walking around the place. I've sat in one of the community classrooms. It still exists. It's still thriving, and there's still lots of young people ready to use our services. So that was really, really good, and it was a really positive point. I would also like to say thank you to Richard, Rebecca, and Georgia, and also Professor Carolyn Jackson, who initially sent this invitation to attend this seminar series. So, as Georgia said, my presentation today is about NEET youth, education needs, hopes and aspirations. Just a little bit of a caveat, it was funded by the Economic Social Research Council via the University of Sheffield as a doctoral studentship a number of years ago, and I'm currently based at Leeds Trinity University. So, what has informed my research? Life experience, the everyday lives of young people around me. So I'm previously a youth worker, a youth support worker, and a community volunteer. And this was something that is really, really close to my heart as well as a research interest. And hopefully today you will actually see how that has developed over a number of years. So I've been an academic for about 11 years. I carried out my doctoral research during 2018 to 2021. There was lots of changes during that time, intersecting crises associated with Brexit, COVID-19, the legacies of deindustrialization, stigmatization of young people within educational policy, and now geopolitical instability across the globe. So these are really, really, really salient issues that were really apparent to the young people and still continue to be to present day. So I'm just going to try and move along on the slides. So, as I've said, I'm a sociologist, and these deeply personal troubles are public issues. This is what C. Wright Mills wrote about in the sociological imagination back in the 1960s. I would ask you to reflect on what you see on this site. Do you see the legacies of deindustrialization? Do you see poverty? Do you see devastation? Or do you see spaces of hope and aspiration? Because a lot of the young people who I undertook research with who were NEET experienced, that is, not in education, employment, or training, felt so much hope about these spaces. These were deindustrialized legacies. So place where I undertook the research in the north of England historically had a thriving industry in cotton. Jobs aplenty. Lots of young people went on youth training schemes, for example, and it was really alive and well. If we turn to present day, we've had a legacy of devastation. We've had a legacy of housing crisis, young people homeless, subjected to serious youth violence, and often volatile social policy. So this is what I want us to do today, and I hope we can do this, is reflect on these personal troubles and how they can be spaces of hope and aspiration. We can also see corporate actors, like, for example, I've got the photo of the supermarket that overtook the leisure centre about 15 years ago. So spaces for young people to thrive have radically disappeared. They've been replaced with capitalistic interests. They've been heavily neoliberalised. And this is something that I really want to reflect on as well today. So if you want to communicate with me via the chat and just say what you see, it won't be a game of catchphrase, and I probably won't see it because I'm still presenting. However, I would ask, what do you see? Challenge your assumptions. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to speak through a distinct body of research that I've undertaken over the last 10 years. And I've segued this into needs, hopes, and aspirations for the future to talk to some of the most pressing policy issues concerned with young people who are most precarious in society. To do that, I'm going to actually introduce the research that I undertook over the last decade and the methods and the context for doing this. So, as I've said, space and place were absolutely essential to young people's lives. So, these are sites of stigma. We have Imogen Tyler based in the Sociology department here at Lancaster. And I've used a lot of Imogen Tyler's thinking about stigma as a top-down process and how stigma machines are created against young people who are in receipt of welfare benefits or are precarious within society. So I really see stigma, space, and place as interlocking issues. And this has a massive legacy related to the neoliberalization of society and our education system. So I toy with the idea of we want sociospatial stigma. So are bringing together, fusing the ideas of Bourdieu and his work on capital, and also Goffman's work. But then I take it one step further by using Professor Tyler's work and looking at how stigma is a top-down process, using the ideas of stigma machine, social abjection, etc. But you might ask, why is neoliberalism? I've mentioned this word so many times already, and we're only in the first 5 minutes of the presentation. I was recently at the British Sociological Association annual conference where I'm a convener for the Youth Studies group. And the terminology of neoliberalism was dotted around in presentations. It was neoliberalism galore in terms of some of the concepts that were talked about, in terms of how it affects the education system, how it affects everyday life, the labour market, etc. So I've really toyed with this concept and tried to link it together with stigma. But essentially, if we follow Stephen Ball's work on neoliberalism and education, this is a social and political doctrine that has been used within policy for the last 45 years or so. It was most pertinent in the Thatcherite era of the 1980s and into the 1990s with Tony Blair and New Labour. And what it seems to have done to the education system, it's positioned us by politicians as giving individuals and communities more choice, freedom of the market. But what I would conversely argue, however, is that this produces lack of freedom and choice away from market forces. We can use the youth work sector, a sector that I hold so dear, and the young people who took part in my research hold so dear, and also the role of informal education to see how that has been increasingly used as an instrument of the state to provide intervention. That has been heavily neoliberalised, the youth work sector. And I follow the work of Tanya D. Senqua here, who was the external examiner for my PhD, time friend, and collaborator. Tanya has also produced one of these seminars a number of years ago, and this is what inspired me to be here today. So we need to think about lack of freedom and choice away from the market. So competition, how youth work sector is kind of positioned as competitors working with the police, something that the youth work sector did not do previously. But in terms of competition for contracts, evaluation, funding models, and funding regimes, they are often pitted in collaboration and as well with Department for Work and Pensions, welfare agents, and what I've called agents of the state. We also see a historical legacy here, which Professor Tracy Shildrich touched upon about low pay, no pay. So, young people who are in receipt of support services, welfare, conditional welfare benefits, are socially objected by the state, then they're subjected to really precarious employment. And I did see this quite a lot during the pandemic when I was undertaking this research. So, this is really something to bear in mind. We also have an intersectional crisis here with the education system, specifically for young people who identify as working class, are from the global majority, and are also economically marginalised. So, children who are special educational needs and disability classed faced a higher exclusion rate than their non-SEN peers. The data is absolutely astounding, and this intersects as well with young people who later go on to be not in education, employment, or training in that category. So they don't have the recognised needs within the education system. I've spoke to parents and young people and loved ones of young people in this situation, and also academics. And historically, they've been deprived of educational healthcare and support plans, um, often battling with local authorities, and subjected to illegal exclusions from school. So we start to see this with some of the work that I'm doing currently with Professor Seamus Byrne, who's based in the Institute for Children's Futures at the Manchester Metropolitan University. We also see this as well, that some of the pioneering work that I'm doing with colleagues at Leeds Trinity University, specifically Dr. Kirsty Bennett, who runs the cold case unit at our university, is that young people who are NEET are twice as more likely to go repeatedly missing from home or care settings and subjected to criminalisation. So, for example, if a young person is subjected to a Section 31 care order where they're removed from the home and put in local authority care, if a disturbance happens, like a smashed plate, for example, they're much more likely, the young people, to have the police phoned on them, to the police attending to disturbances, and then therefore subjected to criminalisation. I mean, it's not that simple. However, it's a complex pathway to criminalisation that we have to remind ourselves of as well. And these are some of the most vulnerable young people in society. We also see as well the cumulative effect of exclusion from school, which really impacts on young people's hopes, aspirations for the future. So, in my most recent work, undertaken and written in the Journal of Applied Youth Studies, we actually saw a long-term scarring effect on future education re-engagement. These were young people who were subjected to youth justice involvement. They might have been excluded from school. And being NEET wasn't the only complex factor in their lives. And I have to say as well that a lot of the research that has been done on NEET suits policy agendas, is speaking to policy, is speaking to practice. But we need to remember that these young people are young people with hopes, aspirations, and dreams for the futures. We are not intending to label them in terms of what they are not. Okay. So we are resisting deficit labels as sociologists. And that's something that I've really tried to do in my career and the career of others who write in this area, such as Professor Lisa Russell, Dr. Charlotte Macpherson, who's based at the University of Melbourne in Australia. We are really resisting this categorization of this is what only young people can be. We need to look much more further and see where things are going wrong. And we start to see this as well with school exclusion. So young people who are NEET are at increased risk of becoming outside of education, employment, or training age 19 or 20 if they've been excluded either fixed term or permanently from school. Some young people have been illegally off-rolled onto private providers. And if you've seen any of BBC Panorama's investigation of private providers within the education system in England and Wales, some of these private providers are woeful in terms of the lack of recognition of young people's dignity and human rights. So these are wider intersectional issues that we really need to get on board with as practitioners, as PhD students writing in education and social justice, or for those watching on YouTube today. And I'll just bring you to some of the key quotes from my research. So, young people who were SEND were twice as more likely to become NEET, as I've said. And we could see this as well with some of the care leavers who I spoke to in the north of England, who actually had no GCSEs, experienced being off-rolled onto a private sector provider, which actually met none of his support needs. So he was illegally excluded from school. Okay, so when this was taken to a tribunal, it was actually schooling was reinstated. But we start to see children and young people being treated like adults pretty early on in their lives, which isn't justifiable, which isn't socially just. And we see this with Aidan's narrative as well. I stopped attending school entirely. I became the centre of a joke for both the teachers and the student. Oh wow, Aidan is in today. What a surprise. That kind of thinking. I was lacking in certain areas because I wasn't there to learn for my GCSEs. When I eventually sat my GCSEs, I was stressed because I didn't know the answers and I didn't know what to do. This was a key finding. A lot of the young people felt like they could not challenge these systems. They were exhausted. Okay. So they were absolutely exhausted with battling systems that they were far too young to be faced with. Same for some other female participants, including Anna, age 19, who was care experienced, trying to get her siblings back into the family home, who were provided to local authority services as care leavers. I didn't know what to really do in school, like I said, because I had things and family issues going on. But I got along with half my teachers, but the other half teachers weren't really, I don't know. I didn't really get along with them as much because of my behaviour. So this is something that the young people have really internalized their own behaviour. A lot of this, young people have agency, their own thoughts for the future, but we have to remember that these young people are some of the most excluded within society. We have to remember that they'll frequently blame themselves for systems that are malfunctioning, for education systems, for lack of remuneration within low paid work. So there was an internalization of that shame and stigma, which Professor Tyler often talks about with those who are in receipt of welfare benefits. And we start to see the polarization of young people as well. This isn't anything new, okay? So recently we had a Labour government elected, and within the first year of the Labour government, there's been blame, attribution, and stigma towards young people. Okay. young people being blamed for their circumstances, which they have inherited. Okay, the rising NEET, a big issue as well for administrative data sets that are available from the office, from the National Office of Statistics. We have to think about how these things are complexly linked together. And there's actually the data about young people who are not in education, employment, or training are produced every month for statistical bulletins quarterly. So we can see the data sets, we can see the data. But what is this not asking? This is local authority reporting. Okay, so this isn't linking together those who have repeatedly gone missing from home, those who are experiencing endemic loneliness and isolation. It's not linking very well those who are Roma Gypsy traveller or ethnically minoritized. There's lots of the picture missing here. And there's an argument that increasingly such young people have become hidden. And that was the case as well in my research, where the young people have become hidden from sight and subjected and attributed towards all this blame, shame, and stigma that we really have to unpack as sociologists and those interested in the education system. So I'll just leave you with a few snapshots about what's being created and what's being ramped up as a stigma engine within policy. But to give you a bit of a context about the research, so, as I've said, I'm from a youth work background. I'm from a volunteer background as well, community volunteer and champion. The community in which I did my research was really, really important to me. I've experienced off-rolling from school. I've also experienced as well being outside of education, employment, or training and feeling hopeless within this and being subjected to stigma, shame, and blame. I've written about this previously. I'm also a victim of serious youth violence historically. So that really informs how I come about this, in terms of young people's rights to be recognised. The context of the research occurred, it was a narrative study of young people's social networks, which was supervised as an ESRC funded studentship by Professor Louise Ryan, Professor Andrea Wigfield, and Dr. Joanne Britton, two of which used to be based at the University of Sheffield. And it actually explored the intersectional nature of care, welfare stigma, and social support, and how these were socially classed, gendered, and also racialized, in terms of where I undertook the research. So I undertook network mapping of the young people's lives, their aspirations for the future, um, used the qualitative elements of social network analysis, which Professor Louise Ryan has really pioneered within the UK in terms of participatory methods and really getting research participants to be involved in that process of mapping what their networks look like and what their hopes for the future look like and what their social ties look like, rather than, for example, using big data and creating, quantitative techniques, and network mapping post hoc. This was done with youth workers, people who are working in pupil referral units, and also the young people themselves. And a lot of my follow-up research has looked at this as a global policy issue. So even though the policy label NEET originated somewhat in England and Wales, it's been used globally. Okay, so it's been used globally to explain a whole host of issues. And NEETs accounted, for example, NEETs in terms of policy, accounted in Australia. They're on the labour market statistics up until somebody turns 29. In Southeast Asia, they've got a completely different way of working with the welfare system, and early intervention is key. The Nordic regions as well, using early intervention and the social work model to support young people in their hopes and aspirations. We've really unpacked this myself and Professor Samantha Weston at the University of Birmingham, who I've previously worked with. So we've unpacked this as a global issue, which is in recognition globally. I've also explored as well, as a follow-on from this, the right to education and how, I've alluded to neoliberalism being a massive issue, to the right to education for some people not being succeeded. So this is the follow-on work that I'm currently undertaking and writing up, and it will manifest itself. I'm under contract with Emerald to write a monograph about young people who are not in education, employment, or training. So thank you to Katie and John for getting that to contract. In terms of methodology, so this was over 1 year. I've seen rapid social change. It was a applied qualitative research project with 16 young people and 7 youth workers, careers advisors, those who used to work for the careers service, support organisations, some well-known support organisations, some not so well-known. And I followed the young people over a period of time, initially from October 2019 to March 2020. And then obviously the COVID-19 pandemic started to unravel in England and Wales. It was a global concern, we know, but it was really starting to gravitas towards the young people and making them decisions about their futures. So a lot of the follow-up research occurred online. I did want to do socially distanced interviews and speak to the young people. I know this seems like a relic of a bygone era, but these were real concerns for the young people, and especially in terms of right to be heard. Their right to education was infringed on frequently, and lots of support workers doing a tremendous amount of extra work to make sure that these young people are supported in their health and emotional needs and intellectual needs as well. So I worked with 4 organisations, including youth work professionals, careers advisors, programme managers, and I followed these organisations post-pandemic, post-lockdown. We wasn't out of the pandemic at that point. Are we still not? So the consequences of such are still yet to be seen. They're seeing this in terms of lack of remuneration for these organisations. Some of the organisations have collapsed, changed hands. So we really have to think about what this has done to children and young people who are NEET experienced. But I will go on to their needs. So in terms of how this was formulated. And it was really complex, as I've said. So several young people, as I said, were care leavers. They were transitioning from local authority care. Some were aftercare involved, so they were experiencing support and care up until the age of 25, and they're funded by local authority. They were in contact with a number of organisations and somewhat lacked um, individual tailored support that met with their emotional needs. And also, interestingly, as well, and for young men as well, this was a key finding that of half who had care experiences actually ended up working within the precarious care workforce. So we know that the care workforce, often lauded during the pandemic, is increasingly precarious in terms of a destination. We know that those from the global majority, those that are working class, those that are economically marginalized, are often providing care for little remuneration. And this started to occur with the young people who took part in my research. So they were part of the precarious care workforce, but they had deeply ingrained experiences of care, i.e., providing care to a family member or a loved one, being care experienced by local authority, having a care leaver identity, and then eventually working in the care workforce, which was very precarious. And also something that I have to cite with Tanya de Saint Croix's work, what really shines through is the heart work behind this, what Desenguar refers to as heart work. You know, the stories that will break your heart, but also the stories that provide nourishment, reflection, and further articulation. We've seen this as well with the long-standing reciprocal care relationships that individuals provided within their communities. So they were absolutely key. So if I take you back to personal troubles are public issues from the work of C. Wright Mills, we start to see how individuals' personal issues are actually public issues that are brought to the fore by sociologists. And we really need to understand that. And we could see as well the need for care, the need for support, mutual aid. That was a key need that wasn't being actualized. And there was a long history of this within the young people's narratives. And we also see the landscape of care radically change. So I'm citing Professor Beverly Skeggs here, who is an emeritus professor here at University of Lancaster. And we start to see care work being lauded, celebrated, you know, those going outside clapping for carers. But we're not seeing the real devastation that's caused here to these young people's lives. These are increasingly hidden. The young people wanted to be recognised and they wanted to leave a legacy as well, no matter what happened to them. They were also faced with their own mortality, sorry, and also a question of personal ethics and morals, which we need to kind of question as well. So I've cited Beverly Skeggs's work here because it's really, really interesting in terms of how care is a capital. So Bev uses Bourdieu's work, but critiques it for the lack of gendered lens. So uses the work on capital because it's a good illumination of how the social class system works, but it's very, very poor on gender. And we start to see this as well with my work as well, in terms of those who are providing care. And we see this in times of crisis as well. So a careers advisor who I had a long-standing professional relationship with, Jenny, who took part in my research, and she provided a lot of care to the young people that was often unrecognised. For example, going to local authority events, showing up to enrichment events, showing up during the pandemic and meeting the young people when they needed some space or they needed to talk to somebody without staying in a single occupancy room in local authority. And she was really wise in terms of how she reflected. She understood that as somebody from the community as well, and had lived a lot of this life, similar to the young people, she started to see about, you know, if somebody's living a chaotic life, as she cites, they've got problems with housing, family, maybe alcohol, drug related activities, they're not going to be ready to settle down and engage in education. And then it has a knock-on effect. She described it as a domino effect, um, using the domino props in one of the playrooms for the young people. And she said, one domino, she said, one thing, another thing, another thing. And we just literally watched it cascade downwards. And you could see how this was impacting on young people's lives and in terms of how they articulated their futures. The long-standing relationship with the Department for Work and Pensions as well. So, Department of Work and Pensions, you know, I've critiqued agents of the state. I've critiqued them for not going far enough in terms of supporting young people for their individual needs, stigmatizing young people. But we also need to reflect on, for those that were in receipt of universal credit or employment support benefits or personal independence payments or job seekers allowance, those young people actually had deeply committed relationships with their careers advisors and their jobs coaches. So that was something really, really important to the young people that I'd not considered myself as a researcher. I'd gone on this narrative from reading the sociological literature of, you know, these people might be enacting blame and shame. But the way that the young people reflected on was he was actually supporting them in really difficult circumstances. And they actually used their own initiative to not sanction the young people. I'm not saying this is the only story, because we start to see real tragic stories emerge about universal credit. And when universal credit was piloted and tested, um, thousands of people met untimely deaths. The disabled were undergone as unsupported. We started to see young people being subjected to sanctioning regimes. So we've really started to see the cold turn of neoliberalism within the state and in enacting violence upon its citizens. And you see that as well with Jake, who was a care leaver, age 19. You know, when you get a job, it affects your universal credit because they can't pay you the same payment. I used to get £251. I went onto a statement and I had £0 in my bank. I said, wait a minute, why do I have zero? I went for 4 months with no money. I would have starved for months and probably would have been dead by now due to them, which he cites as DWP. He had his partner. He was on universal credit as well. He gets paid on the 26th of each month. So he got paid. So they were having to share universal credit payments to support each other when they were experiencing sanctioning, which was of no fault of their own. So we have quite converse tales here and contrasting narratives emerge. And I've talked a lot about stigma. You know, it's a mark, according to Imogen Tyler, a mark of disgrace pressed upon a person. It's corrosive, being shamed or dehumanized in their interactions with others. So Imogen Tyler obviously looks at agents of the state as stigma producers. Okay, the rich, the elite, and how that trickles down. What we started to see with my research was that young people were being stigmatized not only in the media, not only by policymakers, but in their everyday interactions. So, for example, with family members, with those who they were receiving care from, you start to see the trickle down effect of stigma and how it denigrates at personhood. And we can see that as well with the narratives of Aidan, Anna, and Jake, who I've discussed so far. And then we start to see with the COVID-19 picture, the reinforcement of precarity, entrenched young people who were experiencing uplifts of universal credit, trying to remunerate them during times of crisis, only by a small fraction. We start to see an uplift of £80 per month, which was taken away by 2021. That left a lot of young people in really, really difficult circumstances. Also, with youth support services, something that we need to reflect upon, which I did at the beginning of this presentation. So the National Youth Agency, which is the accrediting body for JNC youth work qualifications, has provided a series of reports throughout the last 40 years or so, but more recently has done an analysis of how the youth work sector and targeted support services have been drastically cut. We started to see this in London with the closure of Kids Company. We've seen other providers in the north of England go bust, community centres close down, etc. Contracts not being renewed. But these are some of the consequences of utilising and wholly relying on the neoliberal model. And the NYA obviously ask, you know, is there something different that we could be doing? Well, where is a return to grassroots youth work? That's something that I've campaigned for, along with others, including Tanya de Saint-Croix, the return to grassroots youth work. And in terms of how we can resist the labelling and stigmatisation of young people and empower them to achieve their own potential through informal education. We also start to see, if we turn to the work of Diane Ray that was emerging during this time, growing levels of digital poverty. So, for example, Aidan, who was on a care work course, um, actually learned how to become a carer, surprisingly, through Zoom. So, hoisting, manual lifting, heavy labor, doing that through Zoom, really inappropriate. So, we start to see this fall through quite quickly, and how the government haven't really thought at the time of this going forward. And this isn't the only crisis that we might experience. So, I said geopolitical instability, global wars, what's happening around the globe with the atrocities that are happening in the Middle East. We start to see governments not thinking forward and supporting claims to nationalism, etc. So that's something that needs to be resisted. And how we see stigma as a top-down process, we see it mediated by government policy and sanctioning. I've written this up in the Journal of Applied Youth Studies quite recently, published, and this actually typifies the recurrent crisis in terms of young people who are not in education, employment, or training during the pandemic, but also what this means for young people's aspirations for the future and how often that agency was bounded by contextual factors such as global crisis. And we can see this filter on in terms of geopolitical instability that I've talked about previously. We start to see the pandemic and the ongoing cost of living crisis as an ongoing amplification of stigma, social abjection that Tyler picks up on. So all of society's fears, anxieties, kind of permeating into the bodies of these young people and then being abjected through forms of policy, being marked out as unworthy, utilizing Charles Murray's work on the underclass, which we know has been utilized within social policy throughout history. So we start to see the unfolding of these really complex, entwined stories that are entrenched. In terms of the aspirations for the future, so we start to see reciprocal cycles of care. So as I've said, Aidan, who was care experienced, all of these young people who I cite here wanted to provide care to their community. They were often from minoritized ethnic minoritized backgrounds, but also they were from working class backgrounds. So they identified as working class. Their array of capital was economically working class, as we'd understand it from a Borgesian lens. And we also start to see that as well with Skeggs's work, Beverly Skeggs, who I highlighted earlier, in terms of these young people being subjected to a number of courses, but being seen as providers of caring capital. So they were having to care for a variety of people, but they actually took great pride in that. But they were subjected to so much stigmatization, so much abjection, and so much precarity within the precarious care workforce. So I'll just leave those quotes from Beth, Aya, and Aidan about the complexities of working within the care workforce. They often worked throughout these cycles within 12 weeks, were laid off, reinstated, fired because hours couldn't be found, or they were subjected to contract regimes that invalidated their universal credit. So often young people experiencing forms of destitution, which have no place in today's society. We start to see this unfold. Okay, so I'll bring you to some of the concluding points and some of the key findings. So in terms of what's informed today's seminar today in this paper, it's revealed how key professionals such as youth work, informal education providers are acutely aware of the challenges faced by NEET experienced young people. And they've had to adapt to a series of difficult, changing policy context, work environments, structural, geopolitical change. we start to see how the young people are actually very critical and they have a lot of agency in those decisions. And that is something that needs to be really treasured in terms of how young people navigate their histories, their futures, and curate their stories. The COVID-19 pandemic here and the ongoing cost of living crisis were just silos to think through. Okay. The young people, for a lot of young people, this was an unmasking of neoliberalization, how the state will treat them, and the inequalities in health, care, education, and employment. We start to see as well further austerity measures being enacted. And this is something that's been enacted by the newly elected Labour government, which is something that should be challenged actively. As academics who might have policy experience, as those who provide evidence to government select committees, this is something that really needs to be pushed further, okay? And challenging those in power. We also see as well the needs, hopes, and aspirations. They're very complex. It's very layered, as you've seen today. You can start to see how the researcher informs the research environment. But what I wanted to resist is labeling such young people and hopefully highlighting their hopes and aspirations for the future, but understanding in the same vein that this is very messy. The methods that I used were very messy. The complex circumstances in which the research occurred was very messy. The policy was a whole heap of messy. And we start to see these intersectional stories really unpack. So I'd like to thank you so much today for your solidarity, care, and understanding. I really look forward to questions. And before I leave, I've got a key journal production to highlight. So I'm currently guest editor for a special issue about this very topic. So if you are interested in writing for our journal, please do get in touch. It says the deadline is 30th of May, 2025. However, that's going to be extended. Okay, so please do keep in touch. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Liam. That was a really important and quite moving presentation. So I would like to now invite colleagues to raise their hands, please, electronically, if you have any questions for Liam. Kathy, I think you've got your hand up.
Kathy, we can't hear you. Kathy, you're still on mute. Do you want to type Kathy? And I'll answer it. Okay, we've got one question. And this is this from you, Georgia?
Yeah, I think, well, I'll ask it while Kathy's typing. So this topic is really, really close to my heart, Liam, and I wondered how you felt, and you alluded to it towards the end of your presentation, how the planned cuts to welfare and disability, and particularly PIP, because I think that's often for people who with SEND, that's the gateway into accessing all sorts of other services. And from that experience, I would say that I would see, and I wonder if you would, that the ability to navigate the benefit and support systems is often the only form of social capital available to these sort of participants, and whether or not it's going to impact on their ability to access education and independent living.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question, Georgia. I would question what we mean by social capital. So, for example, in terms of conceptually, are we talking about needs? Are we talking about trust? Are we talking about reciprocity? Because the young people are not receiving from the state reciprocity. So
Oh,
they give, and they're receiving very little. And it's often upon the very precarious themselves, third sector, to step in here. I'm currently evaluating with a reputable funder, which I don't think I can reveal yet, about the proposed cuts, and in terms of what organisations such as Citizens Advice are having to do to step in terms of their research and policy impact team in London, but also this reputable research organisation that provides information to the What Works scheme and the What Works hub. And I'm seeing absolutely astounding data patterns emerge of people long term being in receipt of benefit cuts, not receiving payments on time, being reassessed when fundamentally that would deny dignity, human dignity towards the young people. And I'm seeing this unfold and manifest in such volatile ways. This is something that we really need to be resisting as academics in terms of how we understand young people through policy actors. So I alluded to Stephen Bull's work, and he's obviously very, very critical as well, of these kind of policy actors. And we start to see young people not having their needs, hopes, and aspirations achieved at all. In fact, if anything, it's got worse. And, we were hoping with this new government that it would offer some kind of relief, but, we've got the same old recycled rhetoric. So, in a chapter that I've written with Dr. Samantha Weston at the University of Birmingham, where I've looked at the global policy impacts of NEET, we start to see how, in particular, current government actors, those in charge, are recycling a lot of the stigmatizing policy rhetoric from the early 2000s up into the 2010s and just recycling that. And the context has changed massively. We've had 14 years of austerity. This is something absolutely that, as I've said, we need to challenge, but also, for example, new claimants as well. So there was a lot of new claimants within my research. So those who were going through the process, as somebody who has been a carer for somebody who was rejected from PIP um, about 3 years ago, we start to see the complex form fillings. It was so, so laborious, and I often felt myself having to help young people as well fill out these forms during research encounters. But I've also done that as well for my family members. And, writing a monograph of 80,000 words is a walk in the park in comparison to filling out that very, very complex and ever changing um, policy rated framework for universal credit or PIP. So absolutely, people who are going through that system right now have my utmost respect because it is really, really difficult to navigate. Also, as well, something that I didn't talk about within the presentation was that there were very, very, very articulate and astute people within the community who knew how to fill out these forms. And I can't do that. Like, in terms of my ability, like I struggle when I'm applying for bids, doing a case for support in my academic job. I struggle to do that. I struggle to write about myself. So, these people
the social
absolutely,
capital I was alluding to is the fact that they
yeah,
have that capacity to fill out and navigate systems that I've struggled with myself.
yeah.
And I think if that's removed, that's my concern is that, you know, the
Mm.
systems they are able to navigate, if they're changed, then it's going to take away that very basic capital that they have. So sorry, just thank you for
Mm.
that answer, Liam. That was really helpful. So just to go to Kathy's point, Kathy says you mentioned earlier in your talk about the importance of avoiding deficit labels, and yet NEET in and of itself is a deficit label. Is there a practical solution for researchers in this area in terminology?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kathy, for that question. Um, I was at the British Sociological Association, as I alluded to last week, as a stream convener. I also had a special event on. And the first thing we said is that we are not understanding the young people through these deficits. Like, we absolutely have to resist this. But unfortunately, this is a policy framework that is so entrenched in everything. And even in areas where you wouldn't expect it to be entrenched, it pops up time and time again. So, yeah, there is a solution. We understand young people as young people, but they won't do that, for funding regimes that the youth work sector are now subjected to, um, informal educators, etc. They're always subjected to this language, and it is deeply neoliberal. It is deeply problematic, and it is something that I have critiqued within my academic writing. And, we don't want to fall into saying, the needs. When I say this I say it in a policy framework because that's where it's situated. I'm not trying to explain these young people's lives away through these distinct categories. So they're much more than that. And yes, absolutely, we do need to be resisting that. But we've been saying that for about 25 years, and it just seems to be recycled, used again. And this was one of the issues that I came across when I was having my Viva examination. For those of you who are PhD students and are awaiting Viva, be ready to defend that, why you've used certain terminologies, because Dr. D. Sanqua did challenge me on that, and rightfully so. And it's something that I really welcome.
Thank you. Um, any more questions for Liam? Colin,
Colin.
you've got your hand up.
Can you hear me?
We
Yeah.
can hear you, Colin. Hello.
Okay, I'll see if I can. Can you see me as well? That doesn't matter too much. Colin Rogers, I'm a emeritus professor from the department, retired now for quite some time. When I was engaged, I did work in the NEET and PRU area, coming at it from a rather different starting position from yours, Liam. I'm a psychologist, social psychologist by background. So I recognize the importance of context very much. My interest, I suppose, was much more in the variations between individuals who might find themselves in the same broad social
Mm.
context. So my work was done pre the pandemic. Much of it, I guess, during the Thatcher years, and many of the things that you were talking about were hitting particularly hard at that time. But the thing that always struck me was that within the group of people who were classified as NEET, within the group of people who had experienced time in PRUs, there were considerable variations in terms of how people were able to deal with that. I mean, to put it very crudely, some just went straight down and others got out in a more effective way. Your discussion was very good at sort of establishing the broad context, establishing the problems and the severity of those and the need to recognize them. But I didn't see very much about why it is that some people do manage to navigate their way reasonably successfully through that and move on to do all sorts of things which you might not have expected them to be able to achieve, whereas others are less successful, if I can put it that way, in being able to make that same move. Do you have any insights as to why, given that the broad policy context is uniform, people's reactions are very different?
Well, thank you so much for that, Colin, that question. And it's given me another perspective to think of, as a sociologist who thinks about society and how this impacts upon the everyday lives of young people in general. The individualized narrative is really, really important to consider. What I wouldn't say this isn't about individual resilience. This isn't about sometimes it's as crude as some people got the opportunity to move on, move somewhere else, and therefore they found themselves in more adaptable circumstances with more resources available to them. For some people who stayed within the community, and the variations between them, and obviously gender's a really, really important one there. Um, the aspirations from those above them, so that were trying to help them, those that were kind of like positioned downwards, there was a lot of kind of to-ing and fro-ing about like, would do these young people need to do X or Y? And, have they reached their what they called education cap, which is something that is hotly contested and I don't agree with. But we started to see, for example, a number of young people who were actually in circumstances which were really, really difficult. And I don't think that that was articulated as well in the presentation because of time. But there was a lot of individual variation. And I think that it's a way about there was individual coping situations as a way out of their situation. For example, some still had really strong ties with family. And although a lot of the information that was provided about helpful information about work, about opportunities elsewhere was seen as redundant because everybody knew about these opportunities. Some of it was unique to the individual, so that needs to be taken into account. Um, and some people actually broke away from their close networks and because they needed time away from them and they needed to reflect upon themselves and what was happening with their lives and trying to recalibrate their futures, with the support of various organizations, support networks, etc. One narrative that I did discuss in quite a lot of detail, which will be cut from the final recording, was the narrative of Kezia, who was actually, she resisted in terms of a lot of the stigmatization, stereotyping, and labeling. Um, she was heavily influenced by family members who were not living in the same location, where a lot of it was contextual, neighborhood disputes, etc. But also being away from the watchful eye of the police was another thing. So having space, I think, is really, really important. And that's why space and place is so important to the young people's lives. Having time to reflect, having time out. So, for example, being in work wasn't the be all and end all for a lot of the participants. They actually just needed time to reflect about what they're going to do with their future and kind of not make a decision that will be detrimental for their future, despite the context in which it occurs being really, really complex, really, really muddy, and really, really opaque to get through. So I don't know whether I've answered your question there, but I know that there's like several caveats to it. Um, but I would welcome further conversation because I am really interested in those individualized approaches, and that's what's used within the What Works centres. So, yeah, up for conversation.
Thank you, Liam. Colin, does that, did you want to add anything more or ask anything more on that?
Can you hear me again? Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Colin.
Yes. To some degree, it does. During the pandemic, I just retired when that happened, so it screwed up the early days of my retirement in a bad way. But I was engaged in a voluntary project working with young people who were at school. They were starting their A-level courses, so they weren't NEET by some way. But they were all people who had no family support really for the process of thinking about higher education.
Yeah.
So they didn't have anybody in their family, their extended family, who'd been to university themselves or had any real knowledge of it. And so the project that we were running was designed to give people some kind of role model. So to have people like myself who'd been through the system, who had some understanding of it, would add extra input to the decision-making process for them. It had to come to an end during the pandemic because we were dependent upon meeting up with young people in the school nearby where they were studying, and that obviously came to an end. But it was interesting to see how, again, prior to the pandemic, and then perhaps more so during it, how people varied very substantially in terms of how they adapted. So for some, the beginning of the pandemic just kind of ended the process. They were finding the whole thing difficult. They found it difficult to engage with, and this was just kind of one extra straw in a sense, which kind of finished them off. For others, they for some reason and in some way, they were able to negotiate their way through those additional difficulties and continued. I mean, the path they took would have been changed, no doubt. It would have been more difficult, would have been more complicated, but they were able to continue. Others didn't. And it does seem to me to come down to thinking very carefully about the extent to which an individual is capable of kind of planning out what they see in front of them in terms of the steps that they want to take. Now, that may be just dealing with the benefit system, which, as you said, is incredibly difficult. It may be dealing with the process of working out what qualifications you need to get in order to do the kind of career that you might want to follow. It may be all sorts of different things. But the key difference, it often seems to me, is that some people have that ability to see the steps that are necessary to get from where they are to where they want to be. No matter how difficult and complex and messy their present situation might be, they still have that ability to see the steps that they need to take to move from A to B to B to C and eventually to the goal that they have. Others don't. I'm absolutely with you in saying that the aspirations that the people have are not the issue. I mean, my experience in interviewing several people in that kind of situation and in PRUs was that I was often very impressed indeed by the relatively high level of aspirations that they somehow managed to hang on to. I mean, I would have buckled a long time ago if I'd been faced with the sort of difficulties that these kids had. But what they often didn't have was any clear sense of how they moved from where they were to where they wanted to be. So there's no problem in a sense where they wanted to be. There was a problem with where they were, but the significant problem was how they moved from one to the other. And very often, I think intervention strategies don't recognize that and don't help sufficiently to provide people with whatever it is that they need to start putting those planned steps together. And they're clearly going to be different for individual people because where they're starting from is different, where they want to get to is different. The sensible steps for them to take are therefore going to be different as well. So, I mean, if you're going to think more about an individualized approach, then I would encourage you to do so because there's only so much you can do by continuing to say that the world is a nasty place, is to think very carefully about how you can begin to think about how those kinds of planning strategies for individuals can be enhanced and developed.
Yeah, and that's absolutely with careers guidance and support in terms of training that is offered to those individuals. The individual narrative, so how an individual gets from A to B, that's absolutely key for youth transitions literature. It's been critiqued a lot as well. So, I come from a sociology of youth and education background, and there was a paper about 25 years ago, which was one step forward, two steps back, about the issues that looking through an individualistic lens about young people's lives and how they navigate forward and take two steps back. And this is a more of a, as a sociologist, I would say, it's not about saying, isn't the world a nasty place, but it's also about recognizing the structural forms of intervention and the structural deficits in which these young people are subjected to. And of course, I would say hitherto to that is there are disciplinary differences within psychology and sociology. So there are also paradigm differences. So I get that. But what I would also say, as a bit of a rebuttal, is the fact that we need to be really focusing on, what we do as societal actors, and maybe, looking at the individual narratives. I do narrative research as well, so looking at individual stories and plotting how they change, contort over time, is absolutely key. I use Jane Elliott's work on storytelling and narrative analysis within my book, which is out in 2026. So, but I do follow that, and I do look forward to further conversation about this, Colin. And I think that you and I need to exchange details, because I've learned a lot from this conversation that I've had from you today. And I thank you so much for sharing that. And I hope your retirement's going well as well. So
It's not going too badly, thank you. As long as the sun keeps shining, I'm pretty happy. I'll try and follow that up. Thank you.
thank you.
And I think that's a really nice place to end today's session. And just to say thank you again to Liam for what has been a very important session, very insightful session, and one that I think has given us all a lot of food for thought. So the next session is an online seminar which will take place on Wednesday the 4th of June 2025 at 12:30, and will be presented by M. Oluweto Biloba Odetoy Inbo. And the title is Academic Motherhood in Nigeria, Navigating Reproduction and Care at the Margins. So I hope as many of us as possible can get to that. And I'm going to stop the recording now and just say thank you everyone again for attending.
Thank you. Bye.